What's good? It's Erratic, and I'm gonna be debunking arguments that people like to use, like really ratty arguments that people like to use to go against GT's canonicity. GT is canon, GT is canon to Super, and yeah, I'm just gonna be proving that. So the first exhibit shows that DBS takes place within the 10 years in between the Majin Buu arc and the ending. So according to Toriyama, End of Z is canon to superhero. And also, DBS is within the time skip that mentions the final chapter of the original work, the manga by the way, that's the manga, that the anime adapted. And there is another proposition from Toyotaro, who is proposing that DBS is before the ending of Z. Z isn't in the manga, by the way. At that point, the manga was just Dragon Ball, not Z. He's directly saying the Z ending, which is the anime. That's not the manga. The manga is only Dragon Ball. So I don't want to hear niggas try to bring up that ratty ass argument about trying to talk about that it's just a manga or it's referring to the manga continuity, which GT isn't in, by the way. It's literally talking about the anime ending. Okay, it's the anime. It says Z. That's the anime, not the manga. The manga is just Dragon Ball. And the anime ending previews GT. So if it previews GT, then that's logically just going to imply that it's within the same temporal framework, since a timeline by definition is a set of chronological events or events that happen in order with each other, and that makes it in the same temporal sequence, also meaning that it's in the same timeline. And the second exhibit shows us that they are within the same set of events and that GT chronologically takes place after DBS. And yes, it's official, by the way. Shueisha is authoritative and official, and they licensed this board. So did Bird Studios and other official companies, etc., right? And it's also, like, to add to all of that, it's also from Toriyama's manuscript. And the manuscripts here are deviated from the actual age timeline, because it's not actually the age timeline. It's a part of the timeline as it's the kanjis we see on the timeline board. So no, I don't want to hear niggas saying that this isn't talking about the Shueisha timeline. It straight up is. The manuscripts are literally right there on the board. And in retrospect to this timeline, people may like to say like, we're ratty. It could just be showing different timelines as well. It's only talking about one chronology and one timeline as it's described as the history timeline of Dragon Ball. So it's in states of affairs to one singular timeline. It also doesn't even show like future Trunks or anything else like that. And to add to this point, we literally can't logically do that in the first place, because we know that in Dragon Ball's history, there is an infinite amount of parallel worlds and timelines. And we can't actually create an infinity. We can't actually traverse an infinity within our reality, and that would just be contradictory, because if we actually had an infinite set of events to traverse through, we can never actually reach the present, as we would have an infinite past, and that would just create a paradox, because we would never actually reach the present if we would have an infinite past, as an actual infinite cannot be traversed. And now that we got that shit out the way, it's time to debunk arguments that people like to use against GT's canonicity to Super. So yeah, let's just get straight into it. So the most common argument that I see people use is try to argue that why didn't Goku use the God forms? And there's multiple ways to go against this. But one, you could just say that it's not a logical contradiction, and that they don't have to use those forms by necessity, and that if they are presupposing that it's necessary for them to use the God form, then just ask them for justification as to why that is the case. No, GT being after Super or taking place after Super chronologically doesn't mean that this is intrinsic or that it's necessary for them to use the God forms. This actually moves on to the second point, which is that GT's production was released before DBS, and in the 19s the God forms weren't a thing, and we know that a prequel that is released after another production with new concepts doesn't necessitate those concepts being shown in the event it takes place before, chronologically within the narrative. And this perfectly fits for GT's case, as GT was produced before DBS was even a thing. And in this case, DBS is the prequel that was produced way after. And the fact that they established that it's a prequel is just proving that GT did not get retconned. And the third point is that Goku was turned back into a kid via the Black Star Dragon Balls, which is 2 times more powerful than the original Dragon Balls due to them being created before Kami split. So his power output and concentration can logically be limited. the way he couldn't even use instant transmission, and instant transmission requires extreme ki control, and so does Gaki. And Whis, when training Goku and Vegeta, explains that in order to use Gaki, you need to heavily condense your ki to a point where not a single leakage could leak out. He wouldn't be able to condense his ki enough, as he literally unlocked those forms when he was in his adult body, and now he's a kid again. And to support that third point, after his tail was pulled out and he's able to start growing, he's able to use instant transmission successfully, meaning those limitations no longer are applicable to him as a child. And now, the presumptions I've just proposed is a way to go against the transformation argument, which is external to the narrative. And now we can move on to the data within the narrative for other characters. So another point to address is Vegeta not using his higher forms and like the god forms, and the simple explanation is that Vegeta never got a coherent chance to use his higher forms until the Shadow Dragons Arc. Against Baby he was holding back so he didn't destroy Gohan's body, as killing Baby would destroy his body. And against Super 17 he got Speed Blitz. He also already had knowledge on Super 17's absorption during the fight, so Vegeta not using the god forms at that moment is actually being tactically smart, as Gaki would emit a lot of energy, which 17 can absorb, and him using the Final Flash isn't inconsistent since he knows that it's not going to emit as much energy to meaningfully help Super 17. Then we go on to the argument of Gohan also not using his higher forms, and the reason this is the case is because Gohan doesn't actually train in GT. That's why he doesn't have Beast as an example, and we know that him not training is a result of him being weaker and unable to use his higher forms that require more ki output. And a perfect example of this is in the 7-year time skip post Cell Saga. After defeating Cell and not training and only studying, he doesn't go Super Saiyan anymore. And yes, there is a perfect file statement which suggests he does train. However, interviews and the authoritative intent is more prior and authenticated and holds more reliability than other deviations of external information. So now it's time to get back to my other points. And the first point I made, or the first exhibit that I gave, was about the scan where Toriyama talks about the ending of Z taking place after Superhero chronologically, and this holds consistency within the narrative and intent, which raises the posteriori probability of the proposition's truth within the narrative framework to the point of certainty, as it's simultaneously backed up by the author, so it's just going to be verifiably true. And the second point I gave was about the Shueisha timeline, which shows us that GT takes place within the main timeline, and people may like to say that this can be in context of the franchise, and this is a really horrible argument, because if this were the case, then we would be including other alternate timelines like the specials, but this timeline literally only shows events that took place within the main continuity, meaning it's sequential, so this timeline would only be talking about one universe, and that is just going to be more plausible given the prior data about this board. And it's just going to hold more parsimony to say that it did occur in the same universe. If you know what ontological parsimony is, it's when you take away unnecessary entities from the argument. Saying that it's going to be a different universe just adds an unnecessary entity that you haven't justified. And the argument with less entities that have more parsimony or justification is more prioritized within ontological parsimony. Now we can go on to the Chosenshu timeline, which also shows us the main timeline, and it's in retrospect to a single universe which holds sequential events, and GT is put in the same ages as it was within the Shueisha timeline, which showed us that it took place in the late 700s and 800s, and we see that Battle of Gods take place in 778, which is before this within the same set of events and in the exact same universe. And the Chosenshu timeline also separates alternate timelines, and GT is not separated. And yeah, this is actually supported, as the Chosenshu timeline is literally talking about one timeline in of itself. That's literally what the intent is focused on. And Pilaf getting older is just going to be a self-contained retcon, which isn't defeating the authoritative intent, which actually decides canonicity, and that would also be a retcon to their ages. And once again, the Kibito Kai argument is terrible, because them being fused would just be a retcon, or it could just be argued that they fused off-screen before the conceptions of the narrative were established, and that's just going to be logically possible. So it doesn't even have to be a retcon, since there is no contradiction towards that being the case, and logical possibilities are defined by whether a contradiction is present or not, and in the states of affairs to this context, there is no contradiction present. And people may like to use Bulma's proposition about not meeting Goku for 5 years. However, this can just be a retcon to them meeting, not that a DBS retcons the original ending, as the authoritative intent which decides canonicity has already established that it's intrinsic for DBS to build up to the Z ending. And that would just hold narrative consistency as characters' ages are sequentially older than themselves from DBS. Yeah, so when we compare the two interpretations of GT being canon to DBS and GT not being canon to DBS, giving all the prior data, it's just going to be not only probability raising for GT's canonicity to DBS, but it's going to entail certainty as the author directly makes his postulation externally and internally to the narrative, and the author analytically defines the source material. And if the source material isn't defined by the author or the author, the source material or narrative cannot exist without the one who creates or defines it. So it's just going to be correspondent to DD that GT is canon to Dragon Ball Super. That's the end of this vid, and this actually isn't as much arguments and info to argue for GT's canonicity to DBS. There is way more than this, and the power scaling gets even crazier from there. Anyways, my boy Zeta is probably gonna make a remastered GT and DBS canon video. You can go watch his older one though, and anyways, that's all I have to say last. See you guys for the next vid.